Looking all juicy, juicy, juicy. Oh, the vibe is all groovy, groovy, groovy. Yeah, yeah. I bet you wanna pop out. I know you wanna pop out. I bet you wanna pop out. I know you wanna pop out. I bet you wanna pop out. Yeah.
So in this segment, we're going to talk about sexually transmitted infections, or STIs. There's an ongoing conversation, should I use STIs or STDs, when I'm having that conversation with individuals? Well, in this case, we want to use sexually transmitted infections and not sexually transmitted diseases, for the simple fact that we want to understand the infections so then we can later understand what it means to be living with an STI. Now let's talk about the infection. In this next segment, we're going to do a fun activity where I bring up small little questions, those you giant microbes, where we find out, is it bacterial or is it viral? Let's get juicy. Herpes. There are two strands of herpes, simplex 1 and simplex 2. Herpes simplex 1 is found in the mouth or oral region, and herpes simplex 2 is typically found in the genital region. So, if you haven't guessed, herpes is a viral infection. Syphilis. Syphilis has 4 main stages when it enters the body. The first stage is when an individual gets a chancre, which is a painless sore that can show up either in the mouth, the genital region, or anus, typically wherever entrance was on site. The second stage of syphilis, which happens weeks later, is typically when rashes or swollen lymph nodes or a fever happens, which is okay. However, sometimes for these first and second stages, sometimes they're asymptomatic, so you don't necessarily know. The third stage of syphilis is when it's traveling through the body. You might not get any signs or symptoms at all, but what it's doing is it's working its way up to your neurosystem in your brain, which leads to stage 4, neurosyphilis. Now, this may seem heavy and a lot, but syphilis is curable through penicillin. So, is syphilis bacterial or viral? It's bacterial because it can be cured through an antibiotic. Chlamydia. Chlamydia is one of the more common STIs that a person can contract. It is asymptomatic, which just means that you can't typically show signs or symptoms. That doesn't mean that there's any, it's just the typical thing is that it doesn't show signs or symptoms when a person contracts it. So is chlamydia a bacterial infection or a viral infection? A bacterial infection. Chlamydia can be cured through an antibiotic. HIV. HIV takes over the white blood cells in a person's body, which has major effect on the person's immune system. HIV is not necessarily curable, but it is treatable. Is HIV a bacterial infection or a viral infection? It's a viral infection. Gonorrhea. Gonorrhea, or also more commonly known as the clap, can cause painful urination and pussy discharge from the genitals if a person was to contract. But not always. Gonorrhea is also another one where it can be asymptomatic. So is gonorrhea bacterial or viral? It's bacterial, and it can be cured through an antibiotic. HPV, or human papillomavirus. HPV has over 100 strands, and many of them that the body can actually fight off on its own. However, for the ones that can, or for the more common ones, there's the Gardasil 9 vaccination, which actually protects a person against HPV, many of the ones that actually can cause cancer. Now, is HPV a bacterial infection or a viral infection? It's a viral infection. Now that we squeezed some juice, let's serve some tea. Sexually transmitted infections, or STIs, have a lot of social stigma to them. The infections themselves don't necessarily have the stigma, but we place stigma on a person for having a sexually transmitted infection, or even someone we may not know but presume might have one. Sexually transmitted infections, or STIs, are both psychological and sociological factors that are placed from what we learned at a young age. To undo that, sometimes we have to unpack and unlearn something before we can move ahead and learn. The stigma that we learn can come from the lack of education around STIs, such as scare tactics, lack of information or treatment options, hierarchy of those with an STI versus those without an STI, fear of testing positive, which can cause a fear of uncertainty within dating, love, sex, or romance, a fear of what others may believe, and also willful ignorance and self-deception. Examples of learning STI stigma. STIs are taught as a high risk factor within different types of sex education. This can send the message that all sex can equal an STI when there's multiple different factors that come in place other than the type of sex someone may have. The other example is presenting high risk factor information, such as considering a high risk population can be a stigmatizing narrative to specific types of groups and people, such as those in the LGBTQA+ community or in diverse racial communities. What are the ways to lessen the stigma and really start to focus on the care for a person and not the risk of a person? Reflect on our own internal feelings and fears about STIs. See that we are not projecting those. Have an honest and open conversation about STIs with your partners. Call in people for a conversation on what they mean when they make judgmental statements or jokes around STIs. Learn the facts and teach facts. See a person first before seeing an STI. We squeezed some juice and served some tea. If you're still with us, it's time to sip. Not all people and not all types of STIs carry the same level of internal social stigma. However, any experience with an STI can be a traumatic moment for someone. Also, not all people are treated the same when people think about STIs. Depending on a person, someone who is diagnosed with an STI and informs another person are often received with negative or judgmental reactions. Thus, having a person be stigmatized based on their action, relationships, or choices instead of understanding what it means to live with or have an STI. Well, the tea is spilt and my cup is empty. If anything, remember to give yourself room to learn, to unlearn, and to love yourself. Thank you for getting juicy with Jake.